Accessibility for Bad Guys, presented by Zoe Rose. AliCamp 2021. We'd like to thank our gold sponsors Telstra and Intopia, our silver sponsors ANZ and Coles, and our bronze sponsor How2.
Hi, my name's Zoe and I am presenting today on the topic of accessibility for bad guys. Now, this is a presentation that has a lot of concepts that people who are already working in disability and accessibility will recognise. It is aimed more at people who are new to the field, but also to people who might be looking for a different take on some of the ideas that we've all become pretty familiar with. My name is Zoe Rose. I run a training company, and my training company, Great Question, focuses on teaching concepts to do with usability for able-bodied and disabled people. I am a user experience designer by trade, and I am a high school teacher by training. I am also a disabled person. Ironically, I became interested in disability significantly before I acquired my mobility impairment, which is the result of injury, and before I found out that I am in fact a ADHD person, something that I've had my entire life but only found out about 3 years ago. Now on screen here I have a promotional image from a TV show called Riverdale, which some people might be familiar with. And in this promotional image we can see a young man with red hair smouldering at the camera. That is Archie from the Archie comics, the main character of the TV show Riverdale. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture and this actor is because I want to tell you the story of someone who looked almost exactly like him. So we won't name this person, but if you imagine this face, that's the person we're talking about. So, when I was living in Melbourne, I went to an inclusive design event. Some people will be familiar with inclusive design. We'll cover it a bit later in this talk. Inclusive design is the idea that if you solve a problem for someone who has a really acute problem, such as one posed by disability, you can generate really fantastic solutions for problems that other people, including able-bodied people, didn't even know they had. I was part of a team of 12 designers, engineers, people interested in making stuff, and I and my team were assigned to help this young man who looked like Archie. Now, he was in his early 20s, he had cerebral palsy, he had epilepsy, and he had an intellectual impairment. And he also had a problem. He wanted to move out of home, but he was not able to dry himself properly after having a shower. So what he wanted, and his parents wanted, was for the engineers and problem solvers to come up with a good way that he could get dry after a shower so that he could finally move out and start living independently. So the event, well, it doesn't start well. It doesn't start well. We start in a huge hall, very big, full of people, full of problem solvers, and dotted here and there the disabled people that we've been brought in to help. A lot of noise, a lot of light. There's a long way to the toilets. The toilets weren't signposted very well. It was a long way to the little food table. The food table had little paper plates where if you picked them up wrong, you could, crush them in your hand, and little wine glasses with a base on them that were really easy to tip over. It was very noisy. It was very hot. And there was a lot going on. And Archie, along with some of the other people, was starting to look a little bit apprehensive about how this was going to go. And then the speeches started. And one person got up and gave a really long talk about how great all of us problem solvers were for being there. And then another person got up and gave another speech about how great it was for all of us problem solvers to be there. And if you needed to go to the toilet at this stage, you really couldn't, because it was just so impolite to get up and interrupt the speeches, which just went on and on and on. And Archie's starting to look a bit tired, and I'm starting to feel a bit tired. and I'm not even there as a person whose problem needs to be solved. And it's all kind of dragging on a bit, it's getting a bit worrisome, and then the lady who's organising it says, okay everyone, thanks for coming, let's get started. And the room exploded. I got a picture here of Archie coming out of a fight where he has clearly come off the worst, because that's what happened to Archie in this situation too. All of a sudden, every single person in that room is talking, everybody's asking questions, everybody's sharing ideas, the noise is deafening, and at our table, what we've got is Archie, this nice early 20s young man, surrounded by consultants and designers, all of whom are yelling at him because they have to over the noise, asking him questions about exactly how much it sucks for him when he's wet and naked and vulnerable. Now, I would say that in that story, especially the way it ended, that was not just a poorly thought through event. It was a poorly thought through event, but I would say that it actually crossed over to the point of actually being very dangerous. Archie had epilepsy. Epilepsy for some people can be brought on by highly stressful environments like that. So as far as I'm concerned, that event was not just a failure, that event was very dangerous. And the interesting thing about it was that every single person there had really good intentions. I've got a picture here of the Justice League of America, Martian Manhunter, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman, The Flash, and Hawkgirl. Everyone in that room was there to do the right thing, was doing their absolute best, and what we saw was those good intentions resulted in absolutely nothing. So given that our good intentions really have no value when it comes to dealing well with disabled people, what if we have bad intentions? Picture here of Mr. Freeze, classic Batman villain. Let's have a look. I've actually got a picture here of Billie Eilish. She's holding a bunch of awards and sticking out her tongue. Now, I did try my best on this one. I wanted to have a Billie Eilish joke because she had a song a couple of years ago called Bad Guy, and I thought that would be really funny if I could work out how to include it. Couldn't work out how to include it. Would have been great if I had. Oh well, let's move on. So, what do the bad guys want? I got a bunch of Batman bad guys here. I've got Mr. Freeze, Harley Quinn, Two-Face, the Joker, the Penguin, and Poison Ivy. What do they want? Well, for the most part, they want money, power, control, revenge sometimes. All the good stuff, really. And how do they go about achieving it? Well, they all have teams. They all have henchmen. And the henchmen, as it turns out, are actually extremely loyal. So at some stage, we're going to have to say that all of our bad guys in this situation must have pretty good leadership skills. And that's what we're going to talk about today more than anything else, the leadership skills that our bad guys use in order to control their evil empires. What do? Well, the interesting thing about the bad guys is that they are initiators, they are instigators, they are doers, they are movers and shakers. In a standard superhero story, the bad guy comes up with a really cool plan and really puts some effort into getting something started, and the good guy comes along and ruins the plan. And then in the next story, you do it all again. So the bad guys are innovators, they are doers, they are entrepreneurs for the most part. So we're going to talk about that too. We're going to talk about leadership, and we are going to talk about initiating things, getting things done. Let's look at some principles. Bad guy principle number 1, exploit your existing resources. Now, from the perspective of leadership, existing resources in our workplaces, no matter what our evil schemes are, usually start with the people we are working with. And our workplaces always include disabled people. Question here, according to the last census, what percentage of working age Australians are disabled? Have a think, see if you can come up with an answer. It's about 17%. About 17%, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So that population of people are wildly underemployed given the breadth of their skill sets, but they are definitely in your workplace. As a matter of fact, there are probably more of them than the statistics alone would necessarily tell you. Because, got a quote here, according to the Bureau of Statistics, disability is any limitation, restriction, or impairment which restricts everyday activities and has lasted or is likely to last for at least 6 months. Now, this is an online talk, so I can't ask everyone to assess whether they think that that applies to them, but I will tell you this. When I have given this question to rooms where there was like 100 or 200 people, and I asked people to vote using an anonymous app on whether that description fit them or had fit them at some point of their life, that number 17 starts to look very shaky, 17%, because the results I tend to get back are 50%. Now, not all of those people think of themselves as disabled, and we're going to talk a bit about why. But if your goal, if you were a bad guy and your goal was to get rid of all the disabled people in your organization, not only would it be wildly illegal, it would be wildly unsuccessful. You can't do it. There's just too many of them. You could spend every cent your organization had, every piece of gold in the bank, trying to identify and eradicate the disabled people in your workplace, and you would go broke before you pulled it off. You can't do it. They are there, and they are ready to do the work. Here we've got Two-Face. I love Two-Face. Two-Face has one half of his face was scalded, I think, with acid, and the other side of his face is very handsome. So if you see him from one angle, he looks completely normal. If you see him from another angle, he looks completely distorted. And I brought this picture of Two-Face to talk briefly about the idea of the invisible disability. It's very easy to think of disability as something which is perceivable from the outside, the distorted face, but almost all, depending again, the statistics are deceptive, I think it's safe to say almost all of the disability out there is actually invisible, can't be seen, and it is also critically important, not necessarily disclosed. So to have an invisible disability and tell people about it is one thing. To have an invisible disability and not is completely different. And if you, in your leadership role, are working under the impression that you do not have many disabled people in your organization, a good question to ask yourself is not, how can I support my disabled staff? It is, why don't they trust me? If you think you don't have disabled people on staff, you absolutely do. They just don't trust you to tell you. Sticking with Two-Face, let's talk about bad guy principle number 2, destroy the barriers to success. I've got a picture here, which some of you may recognize as being from the opening credits of the Batman animated series. We've got a great big building on fire. There's nothing says removing a barrier like burning it right down. And I've got some text here which says disability equals impairment plus barrier. Now, many people will recognize that as being the definition of disability used by the World Health Organization. That is the social model of disability, which says that a person can have a disability is an interaction between the impairment that exists in a person's body and barriers in that person's broader context. What broader context? There are quite a few. There's no definitive list of barriers, but there are some that pop up relatively frequently. And if you haven't come across this before, this is a way of making sense of why so many people who met that Bureau of Statistics criteria for disability don't think of themselves as disabled. If they have an impairment which is not interacting with a barrier, is it really a disability? In this model, the answer would be no, and in the Bureau of Statistics model, the answer would be yes. So these models are not always clear-cut. 4 barriers that are mentioned by People with Disability Australia. are social barriers, physical barriers, communication barriers, and attitudinal barriers. Bad guy principle number 3. Be alert to potential evil schemes. Now, we've already established that our bad guys are doers. They are movers and shakers. They're the ones who are making the evil schemes. So you've got to keep your eyes open for where all of these evil schemes are actually going to come from. Got a mad scientist here, fairly generic one. I'm going to say bad scientists are bad guys too. They're the ones having some of the ideas that we can actually call on. Now, this may seem like a little bit of a stretch to be talking about disability on the one hand and inventing evil inventions on the other. But there is a strong link between disability and invention, and I will tell you why. Let's give some examples and just have a bit of a look and see. Now, usually if I ask people if they can think of an invention that was made for disability, someone in the room is going to think of OXO Good Grips can openers, and they'll be very pleased with themselves, and I will be very pleased with them too. But we can actually go a bit bigger than that. Touchscreens. Touchscreens were a disability-driven invention. The person who invented touchscreens had very bad arthritis in his hands. He wanted a way of interacting with computers that didn't require the teeny tiny, quite painful, fine motor control use of hands that you need to use a mouse or a keyboard. So he came up with a touch screen that you could use using much broader and more general swipes that were easier for him with his hands. That company was called Fingerworks. It was acquired by Apple, and now we all have phones in our pockets. Email! You didn't see that one coming, right? So Vint Cerf, who invented effectively the internet, the inventor of the TCP/IP protocol, which is one of the ones the internet runs on, also invented email. Vint Cerf is hard of hearing, his wife is deaf. They were both professionals, and it was very difficult for them to communicate with each other during the working day. For example, can you collect the dry cleaning? Are we out of milk? Because they couldn't talk on the phone. That deficit was a driver that led to Vint coming up with the idea of email. Now, unfortunately, his wife didn't like it and basically refused to use it for 20 years. So it didn't solve their problem, but it did solve one of ours. Telephones, another one. Telephones were invented by Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell was deeply embedded in the deaf community. His wife was deaf. His mother was deaf. His dad taught at deaf schools. He was extremely interested in amplification of sound because he wanted to be able to provide better amplification methods for deaf people. The fact that amplified sound could actually be transmitted across long distances was not something that he originally thought of as particularly interesting. Worth pointing out, Alexander Graham Bell was very much against sign language and is not loved by the deaf community. The story, however, remains true. The last one to talk about here is punch cards. Now, we cannot prove that the inventor of punch cards, Herman Hollerith, was dyslexic because it is not possible to make a diagnosis like that retrospectively. We can say that all of the biographical information that anyone has ever connected about him does indicate that he was heavily dyslexic and probably dyscalculic, which is a bit of a problem. Dyscalculia being mixed up numbers, that's a problem if you're an engineer, which Herman Hollerith actually was. He was complaining to a friend one time that he wished he could just have like a machine that could do the numbery bit for him because that's the only bit of engineering he was bad at. And his friend said, well, why don't you make one? He did. It was originally used in the 1897 census in America. Runaway success, and that is the story of the founding of the company IBM and eventually computers. So what's happening there? What's happening across those stories? Well, that connection, that inclusive design, that is what the people in our story of Archie were trying to do, and that is what a lot of people are trying to do. I've got an image on the screen here, which is taken from the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit. It is a picture of 12 drawn people arranged in a grid. There's 3 rows across there's 3 columns across the top. They say permanent, temporary, and situational, and there are 4 rows down the side. They say touch, see, hear, and speak. And this diagram is demonstrating some of the ways that the experience of acute impairment, as experienced by disabled people, connects to the able-bodied experience. So up the top here, there's a picture of a guy with one arm. That's a permanent impairment. There's a picture of a person with their arm in a sling, an arm injury. That's a temporary impairment. And there's a picture of a new mother holding a little baby in one arm. And that's a situational impairment. All of these people effectively have one arm. So if we can solve a problem for the person who has got permanently one arm, who, let's just assume it's an amputee, if we can solve the problem for the person who's the amputee, we will solve for the person with the arm in the sling and the person holding a baby too. It's an incredibly powerful tool for research and development and for innovation. Bad guy principle number 4, don't create your own competition. Now, we know that our bad guys often collaborate. The Joker sometimes works with the Penguin, Harley Quinn works with the Joker, all of these things happen. And Harley Quinn works with Poison Ivy. But if you want a really successful evil empire, ideally you don't want to be creating more supervillains, because they're your competition. Something that's worth pointing out here is that of the supervillains that I've put together in this slideshow, we've got Mr. Freeze, Harley Quinn, Two-Face, the Joker, Penguin, and Poison Ivy. Apart from Poison Ivy, they're all disabled. As a matter of fact, if you think your way through the superhero canon, you find a lot of people there who are disabled too. Maybe through radiation, Spider-Man got bit by a spider, mutated. All sorts of instances of lifelong or acquired disability pop up all across the superhero canon. The leading difference between the characters we have who are supervillains and the ones we have who are superheroes is mostly how society reacted to them. The Penguin was abandoned by his parents. Harvey Dent, Two-Face, who used to be incredibly attractive, was cut out of his social circles after he lost half his face. Mr. Freeze lives cryogenically, by the way. These are all, it's arguable whether Harley Quinn would meet the criteria for disability or not. In some points of continuity, I think it's reasonable to say that she has a disabling psychiatric illness. But all of them are people with disabilities. And the thing that differentiates them from their equally, multiply disabled superhero compadres is the kind of barriers that they face. We talked about 4 barriers before. There are more. We talked about social, communication, attitudinal, and physical. The attitudinal barriers are the ones that have created most of our supervillains. So if we would like to live in a world where we are not creating more supervillains, it would be a really super idea to sort out our attitudes. I'm going to lean on Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy for the next section, because in this section we're going to go deeper on attitudes. We're going to talk about bias. And fighting bias is really incredibly tiring. In this picture, both Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy look incredibly unimpressed and more than a little bit angry. And that's how you're going to find yourself if you have to fight bias in your workplace all day, every day. I've actually called on Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy for another reason. That is because they are our two female supervillains that we're calling on today. I want to mention and then leave the word intersectionality. Intersectionality tells us that when more than one attribute that could result in bias is experienced by the same one person, it isn't so much a question of having a bias plus a bias, it's a bias times a bias. So if you have a disability and you're female, and you're dealing with somebody who has a little bit of a bias against disability and a little bit of a bias against women, you are going to have an infinitely harder time than if you were just female or just disabled. Everybody in our society has a myriad of attributes. It is the point at which they coexist in such a way that facilitates other people having more bias that we often find the worst outcomes. So just be aware of intersectionality in bias. A bias that's worth talking about, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when somebody does something that aligns with your pre-existing beliefs, and in so doing reinforces them, reassuring you that you were right the first time. So for example, if you have an autistic colleague and your autistic colleague seems to have very little empathy, that will reinforce your bias that autistic people just don't care about other people, if that is a bias you have. That bias is completely wrong. Many of the most empathetic people I've ever known in my life have been autistic. But when we see evidence that confirms our bias, we tend to have our bias reinforced. And when we see information that disproves our bias, as for example, one of my friends who's profoundly empathetic and autistic, people tend to ignore it. You accept the proof that backs up what you already thought, and you ignore the proof that disconfirms it. So confirmation bias is one always worth being aware of. Affinity bias. Affinity bias is a tricky one. Affinity bias means having just a very slight preference for people who are just a little tiny bit more like you. It can go down to something as basic as height. Anything that reminds you of you is something you're more likely to like. So if you think of people who are disabled as being the other, as being different, as being separate, as being definitionally not like you, you are likely to impose affinity bias on them. And one that doesn't have a name but I really want to coin a name for is what I think of as benevolence bias. So that's the bias where you say, oh, I have a disabled colleague and it's really hard being disabled. I don't want to stress them out too much, so I'll give them the easier jobs. I won't challenge them too much. I won't push them too hard. I'll pass off the really difficult stuff to somebody else, because I definitely want what's best for them. You rinse and repeat that for a couple of years. You end up with somebody who hasn't had the opportunity to shine, hasn't had the opportunity to show how well they're doing. And guess what? Now we've got confirmation bias, because if they haven't been able to achieve as much as their other local peers, you're going to attribute that to the disability not being restricted from being able to do interesting, complex, and difficult work. Bearing in mind, of course, that disability equals impairment plus barrier. So in all of these instances, I think it's quite reasonable to think of biases as barriers, and they are barriers that are born from attitude. The last thing I want to say is that because we are bad guys and we are thinking like bad guys, unhappy staff are not cost effective. We want our henchmen to be loyal, but we also want them to, work themselves as hard as they possibly can for us, right? Because we are villains, we are nasty villains, and we don't care about our people. We just care about getting stuff done. But unhappy people do not get stuff done. They do not remotely get stuff done. It is very, very tiring fighting bias, incredibly tiring. And every time that you have to use your energy trying to make a calculation about whether the person who you are working with on this project or trying to influence in that meeting is going to give you a fair shot or not, every little ounce of energy that you spend doing that is energy that you don't spend doing what? Your job. So it is not cost effective to have people guessing about how they're going to be fighting bias on a day-to-day. Eventually, if you have to fight bias all day, every day, if you can't get anything done, if it's a grind, you are going to at some point end up being really bitter, unmotivated, unhappy. You're not going to like your job. And in all likelihood, you're probably going to influence your team to be bitter, unhappy too. Unhappiness spreads. Oh, it spreads all around, and at some point, in all likelihood, you're going to give up and quit and take all your skills and your institutional knowledge with you. Now, this is a terrible outcome for absolutely everybody, not just you as the supervillain. It's worth pointing out as well, though, that if 50% of our colleagues that we work with have at some stage or are currently meeting that Bureau of Statistic criteria for being disabled, that's a very large number of potentially unhappy people. So when we eradicate bias against disability from our workplaces, we are not just making things better for one specific disabled person, we are making things better for literally everybody. So even if you are an awful, stone-hearted, unkind, cruel slave driver, it is still in your best interests to eradicate bias and make a working environment where your disabled colleagues can actually get things done. Bad guy principle number 5. Be ambitious. We've got Poison Ivy here, arguably the only not disabled villain that we've seen so far today. Poison Ivy would very much like to eradicate the entire human species in order that she can hand the planet over to plants. She is very evil, but you cannot fault the scope of her ambition. I lied before. I lied about my Billie Eilish joke. Billie Eilish, worldwide megastar, smash hit singles, so gloriously popular. I didn't have a photo of her because I couldn't think of a joke from her song Bad Guy. I had a picture of her because this superstar has Tourette's. She is a disabled superstar songwriter. So Simone Biles. Simone Biles, the greatest gymnast of all time, the woman who has come up with routines so complex that they have been banned from competition because if anyone else that apart from her tries to do them, they will probably kill themselves. Simone Biles has ADHD. Elon Musk, classic contender for supervillain. Also autistic, but we're not going to talk about him because I can't stand him. So instead, let's talk about Richard Branson. He'll do. Richard Branson, owner of the Virgin Corporation, he is dyslexic. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to read you something from Richard Branson himself about his dyslexia. He says, and I quote, "My struggles have shaped Virgin as a company. I like clear, direct communication, and we have an inclusive culture that is more like a family than a business. I wouldn't have started a magazine or built Virgin if I had not been dyslexic. I suspect I would have ended up having a much more conventional life. My father was a barrister and my grandfather was a judge. They expected me to follow suit because I was dyslexic, there was no way I thought I could do that. That turned out to be a big advantage." So forget the bad guy stuff for a second. If you were running a team, would you want to hire a 22-year-old Richard Branson, somebody with this much potential, this many ideas, this capacity to actually get out there, do that innovation, get stuff done out of self-interest. Of course you would. Of course you would hire Richard Branson. This brings us to bad guy principle number 6. Principle number 1 was exploit existing resources. Principle number 6 is exploit other people's resources. What do I mean by that? Well, there is a world of frustrated, held back, high potential disabled people out there. A lot of them are in a position where they don't like their employers because their employers are biased and their workplaces are biased. Especially the employers who think of themselves as being good guys and have lots of cool policies but terrible attitudes. So that if you want people who have the ability to really see things through, to navigate complex bureaucracy, to understand the difficulties and complexities that can occur in the lives of everyone else on your team, if you want people who have the aptitude to work out how to solve very complex problems, you probably want to be hiring more disabled people because that's the kind of thing they have to do every day. And last but not least, bad guy principle number 7, always be recruiting. I am, of course, trying to recruit you to my own evil empire. You'll be very glad to hear that it is definitely a pyramid scheme. But now that you've heard the pitch, go out and spread the word. Tell people that doing good things for disabled people because it makes the world a better place is now over. We don't ever have to do that again. It did fail. It didn't work. We don't have to do it. But you can make life better for disabled people because it's in your interests to do so. That's the pitch. Because after all, as disabled people, we can conquer the world, but we can't do it without your help. So thank you, henchmen. Thank you very much. That is the end of the talk. My name is Zoe Rose. I run Great Question Training, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Alley Camp 2021.